Martha Calloway dug her father's grave alone. No preacher, no neighbors, no one. She was 26 years old, and she did it with a cracked-handle shovel in July heat, because there was no one left in Dry Creek who thought Thomas Calloway's daughter was worth showing up for. Her hands bled before she was halfway done. She didn't stop. When the grave was deep enough, she lowered her father herself, said his name out loud into the empty desert air, and picked up the shovel again. That was the day Garrett Holloway sent a man to her door with a notice that she had 3 days to pay a debt she couldn't pay or lose everything her father had ever built. She buried her father and read the notice and made herself one promise: she was not going to lose. If this story already has your heart in your throat, hit that subscribe button right now and ride along with me until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Martha's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all truly began. The morning her father died, Martha Calloway didn't cry. She stood at the edge of the grave. She'd dug herself because there was no one else, and she pressed her lips together until they went white, and she listened to the wind moving through the dry Arizona scrub, and she said his name out loud, the way it deserved to be said. Not quietly, not apologetically. Out loud into the open air so the desert itself could hear it. "Thomas Calloway," she said, "you were the best man I ever knew, and I'm going to keep what you built. I swear it on your grave." Then she picked up the shovel and finished covering him. That was 14 months ago. Since then, Martha had done everything a woman alone on 40 acres of baked Arizona hardpan could do to stay alive and stay standing. She'd repaired fence lines at dawn with her bare hands when the wire cutters broke. She'd ridden boundary checks in 100-degree heat on a mare that was getting old and tired, the same way Martha was getting old and tired, slowly, stubbornly refusing to admit it. She'd sat across desks from men who looked at her the way people look at something they've already written off, with that patient, half-amused expression that said, "We're just waiting for you to figure out what we already know." She was 26 years old. She was broad-shouldered and solid-built for work the way this land was built for drought, capable of enduring more than anyone looking at her would think to guess. The women in Dry Creek called her "that Calloway girl," in voices soft with pity. The men called her stubborn. Some of the crueler ones, when they thought she was out of earshot, called her worse. Martha had learned early that the best answer to cruelty was silence. Not because she had nothing to say, because she was saving her strength for things that mattered. The ranch was called Calloway Quarter. 40 acres, a 2-room cabin, a barn that swayed slightly in hard wind, and a well that had dropped 6 inches since the last good rain. Her father had scratched it out of raw desert over 20 years, and he'd died with the deed in one hand and a banknote in the other. The note, $1,200 carried from a bad season, refinanced once, had been sold without her knowledge, without her consent, without even the courtesy of a letter to a man named Garrett Holloway. She'd found out the way she found out most bad news in Dry Creek. From Dora Finch at the dry goods counter, who'd heard it from her husband, who'd heard it from the man who shoed Holloway's horses. "I'm real sorry, Martha," Dora had said, folding muslin with the careful hands of a woman delivering last rites. "Garrett Holloway doesn't buy paper he doesn't plan to collect." Martha had paid for her goods, walked out, sat on the buckboard with the reins loose in her hands, and stared at the dust rising off the main street of Dry Creek, the town where she had lived her entire life, and where she understood now with cold and absolute clarity almost no one was going to help her. Then she'd clicked her tongue at the horse and driven home. That had been 3 weeks back. She'd written letters, requested meetings, ridden to the county seat, and paid 2 lawyers for consultations that amounted to the same polite verdict. Holloway's purchase was legal. His right to call the note due was legal, and her options were limited. One of the lawyers had suggested she consider selling voluntarily. He'd said it gently, the way men say hard things to women they've already decided can't handle the direct version. Martha had thanked him for his time and walked out and stood in the street for a full minute with her fists at her sides before she trusted herself to move. She was not going to sell. The morning Holloway's man delivered the formal notice, Martha was in the saddle before sunup, already working. The man had to wait by the barn while she checked her mare's foreleg for swelling. When she came out, she took the envelope from his hand, read it all the way through twice, and looked up. "Tell Mr. Holloway I received his notice," she said. The man, young, clearly embarrassed by his own errand, shifted his weight. "He said he'd be willing to discuss terms. If you wanted to come in and—" "Tell him I received his notice," Martha said again. He left. She stood in the yard holding the envelope, 3 days, $1,200, vacate the premises, and let herself feel the full weight of it. The fear. The grief. The bone-deep exhaustion of fighting alone so long that fighting had started to feel like just another kind of losing. She let herself feel it for exactly the length of one slow breath. Then she tucked the notice in her coat pocket and went back to work. Her missing cattle weren't going to find themselves. She'd been riding the eastern range for close to an hour, past her own boundary markers, and into open scrubland, when she saw the shape in the distance that didn't look like rock. She pulled up, squinted. The shape didn't move. She nudged the mare forward. He was lying on his back in full sun. Old man, white hair, gray beard, skin gone the color of cracked leather. His hat was a yard away. No horse, no water. His lips were split and bleeding. His chest was moving. Barely. Martha was off the horse before she decided to move. She dropped to one knee beside him, pressed 2 fingers to his throat, felt the pulse weak, skipping but there, and made herself breathe. "Hey," she said. "Sir, can you hear me?" Nothing. "Sir." She put her hand on his shoulder firm. "I need you to stay with me. Open your eyes if you can." His eyelids moved. A sliver of faded blue showed through. "There you are," Martha said. "You're all right. I've got water. Stay with me." She uncapped her canteen and tilted it carefully against his lips. Most ran off. She tried again. He swallowed. "Easy," she said. "Small sips. Don't rush it." His hand came up, shaking, slow, and closed around her wrist. Not grabbing. Holding. Like a man making sure something real was there. "You're real," she said. "I'm real. You're not alone." He swallowed again. "What's your name?" she asked. A long pause, air rattling in his chest. "Walter." "Walter what?" "Whitmore. I'm Martha Calloway. You wandered onto my land, Mr. Whitmore. I'm going to get you back to my place and take care of you. Can you tell me how long you've been out here?" "Don't rightly know." Each word cost him. Horse spooked. Lost him. "Which direction were you headed?" "West." "You were going east," Martha said. A silence. Then very quietly, "Ah." "Heat does that," she said. "Don't trouble yourself about it." She got her arms under him. He was lighter than a man had any right to be. The desert had already taken so much, and she got him upright, and then onto the mare and swung up behind him with one arm around his middle and turned toward home. The ride back took 40 minutes. By the time she pulled up at the cabin, his head was drooping against her shoulder. She got him through the door and onto her bed. The only bed, pulled his boots off, covered him despite the heat, because he was shivering, and spent the next hour giving him water, then broth, then carefully working salve into the cracked skin of his hands and forearms. He watched her work with those faded blue eyes, saying nothing. "You have family?" she asked. "Anyone I should get word to?" "No." "Traveling alone through open desert," she said. Not a question. "I prefer open land," he said. "Been in cities too long." She looked at him. Past 60, maybe closer to 70. Clothes worn, but well cut, the wearing of hard use, not poverty. His hands had the calluses of a man who'd done many kinds of work over a long life. "Well," she said, "you're welcome here until you're fit to ride. We'll see about your horse when you're stronger." "That's very kind," he said. "More than I deserve from a stranger." "You weren't asking for kindness," Martha said. "You were just lying there." Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close. True enough. She left him to sleep and went back to her day. Fence to mend, cattle to account for. The problem of Garrett Holloway and $1,200 sitting in her coat pocket like a stone she couldn't put down. She worked until dark, came in, checked on her patient. Breathing steadily, Better Color made supper and sat at the table with a stub of pencil and a piece of paper, and tried once more to work the numbers into something that made sense. 200 in savings, 23 head of cattle she couldn't sell fast enough. 40 acres Holloway wanted so badly he'd manufactured a 3-day deadline. She could go to him. She could sit across his table and let him offer terms, a managed sale he'd call it. Walk away with something instead of nothing. Sign over her father's life's work for enough to start somewhere smaller, somewhere nobody knew her name. She pressed her forehead to the cold window glass and looked at the dark shapes of her barn, her fence line, her land, and the refusal moved through her the way water moves through stone, patient, absolute, impossible to stop. She was not going to Holloway. Behind her, "You're still up." She turned. Walter Whitmore had his eyes open. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Trouble." She almost said no. It was reflex. She'd been saying no for 14 months to everyone who asked with that careful look. She stopped herself. "There's a man named Garrett Holloway," she said. "He bought my debt off the bank, and now he's calling it due. $1,200 in 3 days. There isn't a soul in Dry Creek with the nerve to stand against him." Walter was quiet. "What does he want with your land?" "Everything," Martha said. "That's how men like him operate. They want everything, and they want you gone, so there's no one left who remembers what it looked like before they owned it." "Your water," Walter said. "The creek access." She looked at him sharply. It was a precise question for a sick man in a borrowed bed. "You know about water rights." "I know about land," he said simply. "The east pasture, that's your real value. Most of the homesteads around here lost surface water 2 years ago. Mine's down but not dry. That's why he wants it." Walter nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already suspected. "You've been very kind to me tonight, Martha." "Don't worry about that," she said. "Sleep." She blew the lamp and lay down on the floor with a blanket and her coat folded under her head, and she stared at the dark ceiling and worked the problem from every angle she could find, and when sleep finally took her, she had not found the answer. But she had not stopped looking. She was up before first light stove going coffee on. She went to check on Walter and found the bed empty, the blanket folded neatly at the foot, and a piece of paper on the pillow. The handwriting was precise and clean, a man who valued accuracy. "Martha, I have no words sufficient for what you did. You gave everything to a stranger who had nothing to offer. That is rarer than you know. I am sorry to leave without proper goodbye. I have business that cannot wait. But I find I cannot leave this county without seeing to something first. Don't give up that land. W. Whitmore." She read it twice, set it on the table, poured her coffee. Then she saddled up and rode to Dry Creek, because she was not the kind of woman who waited for things to happen to her. The bank manager, Harold Fitch, received her in his office with the expression of a man who had been dreading exactly this visit. "Martha," he said once she'd finished, "I wish there were something I could do, truly. But the note was sold legally. Mr. Holloway has every right." "I'm not disputing his right," Martha said. "I'm asking about a formal extension, a refinancing, any mechanism that exists. The decision rests entirely with Mr. Holloway." "Then bring him in," Martha said. "Have this conversation with him in the room." Fitch shifted. "I don't think that would be productive." "I think it would be very productive," Martha said quietly. "I think it would be productive for him to look me in the face while he explains why a debt that's been serviceable for years suddenly needs to be paid in full in 72 hours. She leaned forward slightly. "I know what he's doing. You know what he's doing. Every man in this county with eyes in his head knows what Garrett Holloway is doing. I'm asking if there is one person willing to say so out loud." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Fitch polished his spectacles. "I'm sorry," he said. "There's nothing I can do." Martha stood, put on her hat. "No," she said. "I didn't think there would be." She walked out into the full heat of the main street and stopped. Garrett Holloway was standing directly across from the bank entrance. How was not what people expected when they heard his name spoken in frightened voices. He was not large or loud. He was a compact, well-dressed man of about 50, with a trimmed gray beard, and the kind of stillness that came from a man who had never once in his adult life been uncertain whether he was going to get what he wanted. He had two men behind him. He was looking at Martha the way a man looks at a transaction he's already closed. "Miss Calloway," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "I was hoping to run into you." "I'm sure you were," Martha said. "I want you to know this isn't personal." His voice was smooth, almost kind. "Your father was a decent man. I have nothing against the Calloway name, but business is business, and that note is due." "You had that note purchased before my father was in the ground," Martha said. "Don't tell me it isn't personal." Something moved in Holloway's eyes, brief, quickly controlled. "I'd encourage you to think carefully about your position," he said. "I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for a voluntary sale. You'd walk away with something. That's more than the courts will give you when the 3 days are up." "The courts," Martha said, "assume everything goes the way you've planned it." Holloway smiled. "In my experience, things tend to." "In my experience," Martha said, "the men who say that are usually wrong at least once." She walked past him. She did not look back. She could feel his eyes on her back the whole length of the street, and she kept her spine straight and her stride even, and she did not let him see one single thing he could use. She was shaking by the time she reached her horse. Not from fear, from the effort of not showing it. She rode home hard. She was still brushing down the mare when she heard the wagon. She came out of the barn and stopped. A proper wagon-matched team of bays drivers she didn't know. 2 riders alongside, well-dressed, with the look of men who worked for someone important. And in the wagon seat, wearing clothes clearly borrowed, too short in the sleeve, too wide in the shoulder, was Walter Whitmore. He looked entirely different from the man she'd pulled from the desert. His color was back. His spine was straight. And there was something in the way his gaze moved across her property that had not been there before. Careful, precise, the assessment of a man accustomed to measuring the worth of things. He raised a hand when he saw her. She walked out to meet them. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Martha." He climbed down from the wagon, carefully, still stiff, and stood before her. "I told you I had business to attend to." "So you did. There are some people I'd like you to meet." He turned to the 2 riders who had dismounted. "James Hartwell, my company's legal counsel. Samuel Cross, regional operations." He paused. "I owe you something I should have said before I left this morning. I owe you the truth about who I am." Martha looked at the wagon, the team, the 2 well-dressed men, and she felt the ground shift slightly beneath her feet, the way it did before an earthquake, that moment of warning, before everything changed. "I'm listening," she said. "I'm not a wanderer," Walter said. "I travel alone because I prefer to see land without a company of men around me, changing what I observe. But I am not poor, and I am not lost, not in the way I let you believe." He met her eyes directly. "My name is Walter Whitmore. I own the Whitmore Pacific Railroad Company. We've been surveying a rail line through this territory for 2 years. I was out in that desert mapping a potential route when my horse threw a shoe and bolted." The silence stretched out flat and wide as open range. Martha looked at him for a long moment. "A railroad," she said. "Yes." "You own a railroad?" "Yes." "And you were face down dying in the desert in borrowed clothes because your horse threw a shoe." "The horse also had opinions about the route," Walter said, and something in his voice was almost dry. "They were wrong opinions, but he held them firmly, despite everything. Despite Holloway, and the notice, and the 2 days remaining, and the shaking that had not entirely left her hands since the street in Dry Creek." Martha almost laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound a woman made when reality had stopped following any rules she recognized. "James," Walter said, turning to his lawyer, "tell her what you found." Hartwell stepped forward. He was a lean, precise man with a leather satchel and the careful eyes of someone who dealt in facts for a living. "Mrs. Calloway, we've been reviewing land records, debt transactions, and water rights filings for this county going back 8 years. He opened the satchel and produced a sheaf of papers. "Garrett Holloway has been running a systematic acquisition scheme. He identifies properties with water access manufacturers, debt crises through falsified or manipulated loan transfers, then acquires at distressed prices. We've identified 11 other families in this county alone who've been through the same process. Most of them lost their land. 3 of them signed documents they didn't understand under what amounts to legal coercion. He paused. Your case is not unique, Mrs. Calloway, and that is actually to your advantage. Martha stood very still. He's done this to 11 families, she said. At minimum, Hartwell said. We're still reviewing records. And nobody stopped him. Nobody had the documentation, the resources, or the legal standing to make it worth the fight. Hartwell looked at her steadily. You now have all 3. Martha looked from Hartwell to Cross, to Walter Whitmore, who was watching her with those faded blue eyes that were. She now understood the eyes of a man who had seen a great deal of the world and was not easily surprised by any of it. Why? She said. She directed it at Walter. Why are you doing this? Because you dragged me out of the desert when you had every reason to ride past, he said. Because you gave me your bed and your food, and you didn't ask for anything. Because you sat up half the night working a problem that had no answer, and you still didn't quit. He paused. And because Garrett Holloway has been stealing water rights from homesteaders in a county where I intend to build a railroad, which means his corruption affects my business, which means I have excellent professional reasons alongside the personal ones. The water rights, Martha said slowly. The rail line needs water access. Every rail line does, Walter said. And I would rather make fair agreements with honest landowners than inherit whatever Holloway has built through threats and fraud. He looked at her property, the barn, the fence line, the land her father had carved from nothing. Your water access is genuinely valuable, Martha. Not just to Holloway. To me. To the whole territory. And you deserve to benefit from what you've protected. Martha was quiet for a moment. What happens next? She asked. Tomorrow morning, Hartwell said. We file an emergency injunction blocking any foreclosure action on this property, pending a full investigation into the debt transfer. We've already been in contact with the Territorial Land Office and the Federal Circuit Court representative in Tucson. Holloway's deadline becomes legally unenforceable by morning. He won't accept that quietly, Martha said. He has men. He has the sheriff. The sheriff received a visit from Mr. Cross this afternoon, Hartwell said. He's reconsidering his professional relationships. Martha let out a slow breath. She looked at Walter. You did all of this today. I've been building railroads for 30 years, Walter said. I know how to move quickly when the situation requires it. A pause. Also, you saved my life. I was motivated. She looked at him for a long moment. This old man who had been half dead in her desert 24 hours ago, and was now standing in her yard, having apparently rearranged the legal and financial landscape of Redemption County before supper. You'll stay for the night, she said finally. It wasn't a question. If you'll have us, Walter said. I've got floor space and good coffee, Martha said. It's not the hotel. No, Walter said. It's considerably better. She turned toward this cabin. Then she stopped. She turned back to face Walter Whitmore, railroad baron, desert survivor, the most improbable thing that had ever ridden onto Calloway Quarter, and she looked at him the way she'd looked at this land all her life, straight on, without flinching, taking the full measure of it. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Walter. Walter. She nodded once. Thank you. He tipped his hat, an old gesture, courtly and genuine. Thank you, Martha, he said, for not riding past. She went inside to put on more coffee, and for the first time in 14 months, the notice in her coat pocket felt like something other than a death sentence. It felt like the opening move of a fight she might actually win. The coffee was still hot when James Hartwell spread his papers across Martha's kitchen table, and the real conversation began. Walter sat at the end of the table with his hands wrapped around a tin cup, and Samuel Cross pulled a chair from the wall, and Martha stood at the stove, because she was too wound up to sit. And Hartwell the lawyer with the careful eyes laid out what they had found in the county records, the way a surgeon lays out instruments before an operation. Methodical. Precise. Without comfort. The first thing you need to understand, Hartwell said, is that Holloway didn't target you specifically, Mrs. Calloway. He targeted the water. Martha, she said. Martha. He adjusted his spectacles. He's been mapping water access in this county for 6 years. Every homestead with surface rights to any tributary of Copper Creek, he's had a man watching them. Waiting for a bad season. Waiting for a death in the family. Waiting for the moment when someone is vulnerable enough that a manufactured debt crisis looks like the only thing standing between them and ruin. Because that's exactly what it is, Martha said. Yes. But what makes your situation different from the 11 families who lost their land is this. He tapped a specific document. Your father's original note was a straightforward bank loan. When it was sold to Holloway, there were supposed to be notification requirements, proper, legal notice, a waiting period, an opportunity to match the sale price. None of those procedures were followed. The bank manager, Harold Fitch, signed off on a transfer that was at minimum irregular. At maximum, it was fraud. Martha turned from the stove. Fitch knew. Fitch signed, Hartwell said carefully. What he knew is a question for a court. He knew, Martha said. He sat across that desk from me today and told me there was nothing he could do. He knew the whole time. The kitchen went quiet, except for the wind outside and the sound of the coffee settling in the pot. Walter set down his cup. Harold Fitch is a frightened man who made a choice he can't undo, he said. Men like that are either your worst enemy or your most useful witness, depending on how the pressure lands. And how does the pressure land? Martha asked. Walter looked at Hartwell. We file the injunction at first light, Hartwell said. Once Holloway knows his deadline is unenforceable, he'll move to his next option, which is to come at this differently. Social pressure intimidation. Possibly an attempt to discredit you or manufacture a separate legal problem. He's done that before. The Hendersons 2 years ago, he couldn't get their land through the debt, so he had someone accuse the husband of tampering with water rights documentation. By the time the accusation fell apart, the Hendersons couldn't afford the legal fight and sold anyway. He ruins people, Martha said flatly. He's very good at it, Cross said. It was the first time he'd spoken, and his voice was quiet and factual in a way that was somehow worse than anger. He's been very good at it for a long time because no one has ever had the resources to stand against him all the way to the end. Martha looked at Walter. And now? Now, Walter said someone does. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove and poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't need and stood there with it cooling in her hands, thinking. 11 families. She kept coming back to that number. 11 families who had sat in the same position she was sitting in tonight, who had felt the same weight in their chests, who had probably told themselves the same things. There has to be a way. There has to be someone. This cannot be how it ends, and then lost anyway. 11 families who were gone from this county now, or reduced to sharecropping their own former land, or scattered to towns where nobody knew their names. I want to talk to them, she said. Walter looked up. The families. The ones still in the county. The ones Holloway didn't manage to drive out entirely. She set down her cup. If we're going to make a real case, if we're going to do this in a way that sticks, we need witnesses who lived through what he did. We need people willing to stand up and say what happened to them. Hartwell was already nodding slowly. That would significantly strengthen the case. The challenge is that most of those families are afraid. Holloway still controls enough of the local economy. The feed supplier, 2 of the larger cattle contracts, that people who speak against him risk more than just legal trouble. I know, Martha said. But I also know those people, some of them. Pete Dawson knows the Hendersons. Clara Dawson went to school with Ruth Henderson. She paused. People are braver when they're not alone. That's been Holloway's whole strategy. Keep everyone isolated. Keep everyone thinking they're the only one. Keep them too ashamed of their own situation to compare notes with the neighbor. Walter was watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Go on. If I can get 3 or 4 of those families in the same room, Martha said, and they can hear each other's stories, hear that what happened to them wasn't an accident, wasn't their failure, wasn't some personal weakness that left them vulnerable. They'll talk. People will fight for each other when they won't fight for themselves. Hartwell looked at Walter. Walter looked at Martha. You've thought about this for longer than today, Walter said. I've thought about Holloway for 3 weeks, Martha said. I just didn't have any way to do anything about it until tonight. Cross leaned forward. There's a risk. If Holloway hears you're organizing the affected families, and he will hear this is a small county, he'll move faster. He can't legally foreclose now, but he has other tools. He could go after your cattle operation directly. Interfere with your supplier relationships. Make it difficult or impossible to move your herd to market. He can try, Martha said. My herd is small enough that I can move it myself to the county line if I have to. And I don't owe money to anyone Holloway controls. She paused. Yet. That might change if this takes long enough. It shouldn't take long, Hartwell said. The federal circuit judge has jurisdiction over land fraud cases that cross county lines. If we can demonstrate a pattern which the documents already suggest, he can pull the entire investigation up to the federal level, which takes it entirely out of Holloway's local influence. How long? Martha asked. If everything moves the way it should. 3 weeks. A month. And if it doesn't move the way it should? Hartwell paused just a fraction too long. Longer, he said. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Outside, a night wind had come up off the desert, the kind of wind that didn't cool things down, but just moved the heat around. All right, Martha said. First light, you file the injunction. I'll ride to the Dawsons at sunup and start there. Walter. She stopped still, not entirely used to the name in that context. The name attached to this man who had remade himself in her kitchen from dying stranger to something considerably more formidable. You'll stay in Dry Creek. I'll be where I'm needed, Walter said. The hotel in town, Cross said. We've taken rooms, 3 of us and 2 of the riders. You'll want someone on this property overnight, Walter said, looking at Martha directly. Cross? I'm fine alone, Martha said. I'm sure you are. Cross will stay anyway. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the calm certainty of a man who had learned how to be immovable without being unkind. Fine, she said after a moment. He can have the barn. Cross nodded, unsurprised. They worked for another hour, Hartwell walking her through the injunction process. What to expect. Expect what Holloway's likely responses would be, what she should and should not say if he approached her again directly. Walter said little during this part. He drank his coffee and listened, and occasionally asked a single specific question that reframed everything that had just been discussed in a way that made Martha understand why men moved railroad lines for this man. He thought in different dimensions than most people. When Hartwell finally gathered his papers, it was past 10. Martha showed them to the door, gave Cross a lantern and directions to the barn, and stood in the doorway watching the wagon roll toward town with Hartwell and the driver. Walt was the last to leave. He stood at the edge of the porch and looked out at the dark land, and for a moment he was quiet. You're worried, Martha said. Holloway is smart, Walter said. I want you to understand that. He's built this operation over 6 years without anyone touching him. That's not luck. That's intelligence and patience, and a willingness to do things other men won't do. He turned to look at her. Don't underestimate him because we have the legal standing now. Legal standing and physical reality are 2 different things. I know that, Martha said. I know you know it, he said. I'm saying it anyway. Lock your door tonight. I've been locking my door for 14 months, Martha said, since before I knew his name. Walter studied her for a moment. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow starts early. It always does, Martha said. She watched him ride toward town until the dark swallowed him. Then she went inside, locked the door, checked the window latches, and lay down on her own bed. Walter had insisted she take it back and stared at the ceiling in the dark. She was not afraid. She'd made a decision somewhere in the last 3 hours, a decision that had settled into her bones, like water into dry ground. Quiet thoroughgoing all the way down. She was going to see this through, all the way through, whatever it cost. She closed her eyes and slept. She was up before the sun. Cross was already awake in the barn when she went to feed the mare. He was a quiet man, efficient, who took up very little space for someone who was clearly capable of a great deal. He helped her with the morning feeding without being asked and without making a production of it, and she decided she didn't mind having him around as much as she'd thought she would. She was saddled and ready to ride by the time the sun was fully up. She'd left a note for Cross on the barn post. Back by midday water. The mare if she looks hot when you put her in. And she rode southwest toward the Dawson place. Pete Dawson was in his yard when she arrived. He saw her coming, and she could see him steeling himself slightly, that particular posture of a man who expected to be asked for something he'd already decided he couldn't give. She dismounted before he could say anything. "Pete," she said, "I need to talk to you and Clara, both of you together. It won't take long, and I promise I'm not here to ask you for money." He blinked. "All right," he said slowly. "Come in." Clara was at the table with her mending when Martha came through the door. She looked up with that careful, watchful expression. Martha recognized the face of a woman who'd been watching her husband avoid things for long enough that she'd developed a permanent habit of bracing. Martha sat down. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them both. 11 families, she said. That's how many Holloway has done this to in this county. Not just me, not just the Hendersons. 11 families, all with water access, all hit with the same manufactured debt scheme, all picked off one by one because they were alone and they were ashamed, and they didn't know they weren't the only ones. Clara set down her mending. Pete went very still. "Where are you getting that number?" Pete said. "A lawyer who spent yesterday going through 8 years of county records," Martha said. "It's documented. The irregularities in the debt transfers, the pattern of acquisition. It's all there in writing. There's a federal case building, but it needs witnesses. It needs people who lived through it to stand up and say what happened." "Martha," Pete started. "I'm not asking you today," Martha said. "I'm asking you to think about it. And I'm asking if you can help me get in contact with the families you know. The Hendersons. The Greer family from the North Pasture. I know Clara's sister knows Ruth Greer. The Mabry brothers who sold their place last spring and moved to the rooming house in town." Clara was looking at Martha with an expression that had shifted from caution to something more direct. "They took the Greer place too. Same method," Martha said. "Different timing." Clara turned to her husband. Pete's jaw was tight. "Ruth Greer is my sister's closest friend," Clara said quietly. "She cried for 3 days when they lost that land. Her husband wouldn't talk about it at all. Just stop talking near about. It broke something in him. Holloway did that," Martha said, "deliberately and systematically, and with full knowledge of what he was doing to these families. And he's been able to do it because every single family thought they were alone." She looked at Pete. "You've been decent to me, Pete. I know what it costs to stand against a man like Holloway in a county where he controls so much. I'm not asking you to do something that puts your place at risk. I'm asking if you'll help me find the people who have nothing left to lose because he already took it." The silence in the Dawson kitchen was the particular silence of two people having a conversation with each other that didn't use any words. Then Clara looked at her husband and said, "Pete?" Just his name, nothing else. Pete Dawson rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. He looked at the floor. He looked at Martha. "I know where Jim Henderson is working," he said quietly. "Other side of Dry Creek, day labor at the feed yard. He didn't go far. Nowhere to go." "Can you get him here?" Martha asked. "Today if possible. Tomorrow at the latest." "I can try. That's all I'm asking." She rode back to Callaway Quarter with 2 more names than she'd ridden out with, and a feeling in her chest that was becoming slowly and carefully something she was willing to call hope. Hartwell met her at the gate. His face told her something had happened before he said a word. "The injunction was filed at 7 this morning," he said. "Holloway's lawyer challenged it by 8. Martha swung down from the mare. "Already? He has a man at the courthouse who notifies him the moment anything involving his interests is filed. He was expecting this." Hartwell's voice was steady, but his eyes were concerned. "He's arguing that the debt transfer was entirely legal and that the injunction constitutes unlawful interference with a valid contract. The territorial judge is going to need to hear both sides before he rules." "When?" 4 days. 4 days, Martha repeated. "So he can't foreclose during that time." "Correct. But he knows that too." Hartwell paused. "There's something else. Holloway filed a counterclaim this morning. He's alleging that your father falsified the original loan application." that the ranch's stated value was fraudulently inflated to secure the original note. The words landed like rocks dropped from height. Martha stood very still. "My father never falsified anything in his life." "I believe you," Hartwell said immediately, "and I believe we can prove that, but it's a deliberate move to muddy the water, to make this about your family's integrity rather than his conduct. If he can make this look like the Calloways committed fraud, it changes the narrative in the county. It changes what people are willing to believe." "He's going after my father's name," Martha said. "Yes." She turned away. She stood with her back to Hartwell and her hands at her sides, and she breathed through the thing that was happening in her chest. Not grief. This time, not fear. Something harder and colder and more focused. Thomas Calloway had built this land from nothing. He had worked himself into an early grave doing it honestly, refusing shortcuts, paying every debt he could reach, leaving nothing behind him but a good name and a daughter who knew what that name was worth. And Garrett Holloway was going to drag it through the mud to save himself. She turned back. "What do we need to prove the original loan application was clean?" she said. "The original documentation if you have it. Bank correspondence from that period. Any witnesses to the appraisal process. Character witnesses who knew your father's business practices." "I have everything," Martha said. "Every paper my father ever signed is in a box under the floorboard. He kept every letter, every receipt, every note." She paused. "He always said, 'Martha Jane, a man's word is only as good as the paper that backs it up.' He backed everything up." Something shifted in Hartwell's expression. "You have the original appraisal documents." "I have everything." He looked at her. "Show me." They spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with the tin box from under the floorboard, going through 14 years of Thomas Calloway's careful record-keeping. The original loan application. The bank's appraisal of the property, conducted by a man named George Aldous, who Hartwell noted with quiet intensity had died 2 years ago. The correspondence between Thomas and the bank over 4 years of good faith payments. A letter from the bank manager before Fitch, a different man, since retired, confirming that the Calloway account was in satisfactory standing. This, Hartwell said, holding up a specific letter, is very valuable. This is the bank's own assessment dated 3 years before the note was sold to Holloway, confirming that the original valuation was accurate and the account was current. Holloway's lawyer is going to have a very difficult time arguing fraud in the face of the bank's own documentation. "My father knew someone might try to take what he built," Martha said. "He just never lived long enough to fight them himself." Hartwell was quiet for a moment. Then, "He didn't have to. He left you." Martha looked at the papers spread across her father's table. "File whatever you need to file," she said. "Use all of it." Cross came in from outside then without knocking, which told her something was wrong before he said anything. "Ryder just came from town," Cross said. "Holloway's been talking. At the saloon, at the feed merchant, at the hotel. Telling anyone who'll listen that your father's loan was crooked. Telling people that Walter is being taken advantage of by a woman running a fraudulent property." The air in the kitchen changed. "He's trying to turn Walter against me," Martha said. "He's trying to turn the town against you," Cross said. "And against Walter. Make it look like Walter is an old man being manipulated by a desperate woman. Question his judgment." Martha looked at Hartwell. "Can he do that? Can he actually make that stick?" "Not legally," Hartwell said. "But legally and socially are different battles. In a county where he controls—" "I want to go to town," Martha said. Both men looked at her. "I want to go to town right now," she said. "I want to walk into the feed merchant and the dry goods store, and every place where people are listening to Garrett Holloway's version of this story, and I want them to see me standing upright." "That might provoke," Hartwell started. "I know what it might provoke," Martha said. "I also know that the only thing that works against a lie being told about you in public is showing up in public. If I stay out here on this ranch while he's in town, rewriting who my father was, the story sets before I get a chance to correct it." Cross and Hartwell exchanged a look. "I'll ride with you," Cross said. "Fine," Martha said. She was already reaching for her hat. "Let's go." Dry Creek's Main Street had its own weather system, a particular atmosphere that shifted depending on what the town knew and what it was deciding to believe. Martha felt it the moment she rode in. People who might have nodded looked a moment too long before nodding. Dora Finch at the dry goods window watched her approach with an expression that was half sympathy and half the careful distance of a woman who hadn't decided yet which way the wind was blowing. Martha tied her horse in front of the dry goods store and walked in. Dora straightened. "Martha." "Dora." Martha kept her voice level and warm. "I need flour and salt and some coffee, if you have any of the good kind left." She paused, setting her basket on the counter. "And I need a minute of your time." "I've been hearing some things." Dora started carefully. "I know what you've been hearing," Martha said. "Garrett Holloway has been in this town today telling people that my father falsified a loan application 14 years ago. I want you to know that my father kept every document he ever signed. Every receipt, every bank letter, every correspondence. A federal lawyer has been through all of it this morning. There is no fraud. There never was." She held Dora's gaze. "My father was an honest man. He built that ranch the same way he did everything slowly, carefully, and without cutting corners. I will not allow his name to be used as a weapon against me." Dora was quiet. Something was happening in her face, a long, slow calculation, the kind that happened when a woman who had been cautious her whole life ran the numbers on which side of history she wanted to be standing on. "George Aldous did that appraisal," Dora said finally. "My husband knew George. They were in the same Cattlemen's Association for years. George Aldous was the most careful appraiser in the territory. Everybody knew it." "Yes," Martha said. "He was. Holloway knows that too," Dora said slowly. "He must know that anyone who knew George would know the valuation was solid." "He's not making an argument he expects to win in court," Martha said. "He's making an argument he expects to win at the counter in the saloon before the court gets to it." Dora folded her hands on the counter. She looked at Martha for a long moment with the particular focus of a woman deciding something. "Your flour's on me today," she said. Martha shook her head. "I pay my way." "I know you do," Dora said. "That's why I'm offering." She turned to get the flour. "And Martha, I'll be talking to my husband tonight. He knows the Mabry brothers. What happened to them with their land?" She set the flour bag on the counter without looking up. "It wasn't right. Everybody knew it wasn't right. Nobody said so." "Nobody had a reason to think saying so would change anything," Martha said. "That's changing." She rode back toward Callaway Quarter with Cross beside her, and the flour balanced on the saddle, and something in her chest that felt for the first time in a long time like solid ground. They were halfway home when Cross said, "Rider behind us, coming fast." Martha didn't turn around. "Holloway's man. Don't recognize him. Moving too fast for casual." She kept her pace, steady. She would not be seen running. The rider pulled up alongside them. He was young, barely 20, with the wide eyes of someone carrying news he hadn't sorted out yet. "Mrs. Calloway?" "Yes." "Mr. Whitmore sent me. He says to tell you Jim Henderson is in town. Came in on his own. Been looking for you." Martha stopped her horse. Jim Henderson. Pete must have found him faster than she'd expected. Or Henderson had heard something himself and come looking. "Where?" she said. "At the hotel. Mr. Whitmore's got him in the back room, him and—" The young man paused, running through his message. "And a woman named Greer, Ruth Greer. She came in with him. Mr. Whitmore says they've got things to say, and they want to say them to you first before the lawyers." Martha looked at Cross. Cross looked at her. "Changed plans," she said. She turned her horse back toward Dry Creek. Jim Henderson was a man of about 50, with the careful stillness of someone who had survived something by becoming very quiet and staying that way. He was sitting in a straight-backed chair in the back room of the hotel with his hat on his knee. And when Martha walked in, he looked up at her with eyes that were exhausted in the specific way of people who have been carrying a weight so long they'd forgotten what they weighed without it. Ruth Greer was beside him. She was younger than Martha expected, maybe 35, with her hands folded in her lap, and a composure that looked like it cost her something to maintain. Walter was at the table. He rose when Martha came in. "I'll let you talk," he said and stepped out. Martha sat across from them. She looked at them both, and she didn't say anything gentle or preliminary. She'd learned that people who had been through something wanted to be spoken to directly. Anything soft felt like pity, and they'd had enough of pity. "Tell me what happened," she said. Jim Henderson looked at his hat. He turned it once in his hands. Then he looked up. "He sent a man to tell us the bank had changed hands," Henderson said. "Said our note had been purchased, and the new terms required a balloon payment we had no way to make. We went to the bank. Fitch told us the same thing you heard. There was nothing he could do. The note was sold. The payment was due." He stopped. "I had signed documents I didn't fully understand because the man who brought them said they were standard refinancing paperwork. They weren't. They were the mechanism that let Holloway call the whole note at once." Martha kept her face still. "Did you still have those documents?" "Burned them," Henderson said flatly. "After we lost the place. Couldn't stand looking at them." Ruth Greer spoke then quietly. "My husband signed the same kind of papers. He thought he was agreeing to a payment schedule. What he actually signed was an acceleration clause." She paused. "He didn't read it carefully enough. He blames himself. He'll blame himself until he dies." Her voice was steady in the way of a woman who had cried everything out so long ago that the machinery of grief had gone quiet. "But Mr. Hartwell showed me this morning the copy that was filed with the county. The way it's worded, my husband is a good man, but he's not a lawyer. Nobody showed him what he was signing. They handed him a pen and a place to sign and told him where." "That's coercion," Martha said. "Hartwell says it's close enough," Ruth said. "He says close enough is what we need." Martha looked at them both. "I need to ask you something harder than what you've already said. I need to ask if you're willing to stand up in front of a territorial judge and say what you just said to me." The room was very quiet. Henderson's hands tightened on his hat. Ruth Greer's composure held. "I've got nothing left for him to take," Henderson said finally. "My land is gone. My savings are gone. My wife won't look at me the same way since we lost the place." His jaw set. "What I've got left is my name and the truth. And I'll be damned if I let him have those too." Ruth Greer nodded once. "My husband can't come," she said. "He's not well enough. But I can. And I will." Martha felt something click into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the solid, irreversible feeling of a door locking on the right side. "There's a hearing in 4 days," she said. "Hartwell will need statements from both of you before then. Written, signed, witnessed." She paused. "And there may be others. The Mabry brothers. Other families Holloway hit. The more voices there are, the harder it is to write this off as one woman's grievance." "Tom Mabry is in town," Henderson said. "The rooming house on the south end. I can talk to him." "Do that," Martha said. "Tonight if you can." She stood. Henderson and Greer both stood. There was a moment where none of them seemed entirely sure what to do with the feelings that were in the room. The strange raw mixture of grief and anger, and something newer and more fragile than either. Henderson extended his hand. Martha shook it. "Thomas Calloway's girl," he said. "Your father was a good man. He deserved better neighbors than he got." "So did yours," Martha said. "We're going to do better, starting now." She walked out into the hotel corridor and found Walter waiting in the hall with his arms folded and his eyes tracking her face the way she'd noticed he did, reading the information there before she said anything. "Well," he said. "2 witnesses," Martha said. "Maybe 3 by morning. Henderson knows where Tom Mabry is." Walter unfolded his arms. "Good." "Holloway is going to find out," Martha said. "He's going to know they talked to us. He'll go at Henderson first. The man's already broken down. Once Holloway will think he can break him again." "Can he?" Walter asked. Martha thought about Jim Henderson's hands tight on his hat, the set of his jaw. "What I've got left is my name and the truth." "No," she said. "Not anymore." Walter looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you're building here." "I'm building a case," Martha said. "You're building more than a case." He said it quietly, without drama. "You're building the thing Holloway has spent 6 years making sure nobody built, people who know they're not alone. People who know the story isn't just their own failure. Once people understand that they don't go back to being afraid the same way. Martha looked at him. Is that a railroad thing, knowing how to build something that can't be taken apart once it's started? Walter almost smiled. It's a human thing, he said. You just did it faster than most. She left him there and went to find Hartwell, because there were statements to collect and documents to organize, and a hearing in 4 days that was going to decide whether Garrett Holloway finally faced what he'd been building for 6 years. Outside, the sun was dropping toward the western edge of the territory, and somewhere across town, Holloway was in his big house or his office or wherever. Men like that went when they felt their grip on things just beginning to slip. Martha Calloway walked out of the hotel and into the last of the day's heat, and she was not afraid. She was ready. The morning of the hearing, Martha woke before the alarm she'd set and lay still in the dark for exactly 30 seconds, taking inventory of everything that could go wrong. It was a long list. She got up anyway. She got up. Hartwell had spent the 3 days since the hotel meeting doing what good lawyers do, building a wall out of paper brick by careful brick. He had Jim Henderson's written statement signed and witnessed. He had Ruth Greer's statement, which was precise and damaging, in the quiet way that first-hand accounts always were when the person giving them had nothing left to lose. Tom Mabry had come through. Henderson had found him at the rooming house that same night, and Mabry had sat across from Hartwell the following morning with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and delivered a statement that described in specific detail how Holloway's man had stood in his kitchen and told him the options were sign or lose everything, and how the document he'd signed had turned out to be the mechanism of his own ruin. 2 other families had come forward after word got around the Pierce family from the North County, and a widow named Sadie Oakes, who had lost her late husband's small cattle operation 3 years ago, and had been quietly bitter about it ever since, waiting for someone to give her a reason to speak. 5 witnesses, 5 documented cases of the same pattern assembled in 3 days. Hartwell called it a strong foundation. Walter called it remarkable. Martha called it what it was: 5 families who had been waiting for someone to tell them they weren't crazy, they weren't failures, they hadn't lost their land because of their own weakness. They'd lost it because a careful, patient, intelligent man had targeted them deliberately and systematically, and the only thing that had been missing was someone willing to say so in front of a judge. She was going to be that someone today. She dressed, fed the mare, checked in with Cross, who had barely left the property in 3 days, and had fixed her barn latch and retensioned 2 sections of fence line without being asked, which she appreciated, without commenting on, and rode into Dry Creek under a sky that was still more dark than light. Walter was already at the hotel when she arrived. He was at the table in the back room with Hartwell and Cross, and a man she hadn't met before, broad-shouldered with a badge on his coat that was not the Dry Creek Sheriff's badge. She stopped in the doorway. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Calvin Briggs," Walter said by way of introduction. "He's been in the territory for 2 weeks. He arrived independently of us. He was already investigating water rights fraud in 3 counties. When Hartwell filed our documentation with the Federal Circuit Court, it connected to an investigation that was already running." Martha looked at Briggs. "You were already looking at Holloway." "At a pattern," Briggs said. He had a direct way of speaking, economical and flat. "We didn't have a name yet. We had a methodology, the same debt transfer scheme repeating across 3 counties. Always targeting water access properties. Always with a county-level official involved in facilitating the transfer." He paused. "Your county's bank manager, Harold Fitch, is the 3rd such official we've identified." "Fitch is part of it across 3 counties," Martha said. "Different facilitators in different counties," Briggs said. "But the coordination is Holloway's. He's been running this scheme territory-wide. We believe the affected property count is closer to 30 families, not 11. The number hit the room like a stone hitting still water. Even Hartwell, who had seen it coming, pressed his lips together. 30 families. Martha pulled out the nearest chair and sat down. Not because she was weak, because she needed a moment to let the full size of it settle. 30 families, she said. "At minimum," Briggs said. "We're still tallying." "And you've been investigating for how long?" 14 months. 14 months. The same 14 months she'd been fighting alone on 40 acres of hardpan, thinking this was her personal battle, her private war, her solitary disaster. 30 families across 3 counties and a federal investigation already running, and none of it had found its way to her until a man fell off his horse in the wrong desert on the right day. "Why didn't anyone tell the families?" she asked. "Why didn't your investigation reach any of the people being targeted?" Briggs's expression didn't change, but something in it acknowledged the fairness of the question. "Federal investigations don't move the way personal urgency does," he said. "We build cases before we act. If we'd moved too early, Holloway would have buried the evidence, and we'd have gotten nothing." "The families would have kept their land," Martha said. "Some of them. And he'd have found a way to take it later with better cover after destroying the evidence." Briggs held her gaze. "I'm not saying the calculation was painless. I'm saying it was the calculation we made." Martha looked at him for a long moment. She understood the logic. She didn't forgive it. She filed it in the place where she kept things she'd deal with when the immediate fight was over. "What changes today?" she said. "Today, the territorial judge hears the injunction challenge," Hartwell said, taking over. "With Briggs present as federal representative and with 5 witness statements and 14 years of documentation. We're not just defending your property, we're presenting evidence of a territory-wide conspiracy." He paused. "Holloway's lawyer filed a motion last night to have the hearing delayed by 2 weeks. The judge denied it this morning." Martha looked at Walter. "You knew about the marshal." "Since yesterday afternoon," Walter said. "I wanted to be certain before I told you. You should have told me yesterday afternoon." "Yes," he said simply. "I should have." She held his gaze for a moment, and he held hers, and that was the whole of it. No performance, no justification. Just the acknowledgement of a man who knew he'd made a call she disagreed with. "Don't do it again," she said. "No," he said. "I won't." Cross stood up from the corner where he'd been quiet through all of this. "There's something else," he said. "Holloway was at the courthouse at dawn this morning. He knows about the marshal. Somebody told him." The room went tight. "Who?" Martha asked. "Don't know yet, but he knows we have federal involvement, and he knows the witness count." Cross looked at Martha. "He's been in his lawyer's office for 2 hours, and 3 of his riders were seen heading south on the county road before sunup." "South," Martha said. "That's toward the Dawson place." She was on her feet before the word finished. Walter stood. "Cross." "Already moving," Cross said, heading for the door. Martha was right behind him. "Pete and Clara didn't give statements," she said, as she went partly to herself, partly to the room. "They didn't file anything. Holloway has no legal reason to go after them." "He doesn't need a legal reason," Hartwell said from behind her. "He needs a message." She was in the saddle in less than 2 minutes and riding hard. Cross a half-length behind her on a fresher horse, the morning air still cool enough that she could hear her own breathing over the hoofbeats. The Dawson place was 4 miles southwest. She pushed the mare harder than she liked. They came over the last rise and Martha saw the 3 horses tied at Pete Dawson's fence and felt her jaw go hard. She didn't slow down. She came into the yard fast enough that the dust rose around him managed. Across from him were 2 of Holloway's riders and a 3rd man. Martha didn't recognize, but who had the specific look of a man who was paid to make legal-sounding threats sound personal. Clara was at the far wall. Her hands were at her sides. Her chin was up. She was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her afraid, but she was afraid. The 3rd man turned when Martha walked in. He was in his 40s, well-dressed with a thin smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Mrs. Calloway," he said pleasantly, as though he'd been expecting her. "What a coincidence." "Get out of this house," Martha said. The pleasantness didn't flicker. "I'm here on a private matter between Mr. Holloway and Mr. Dawson. This doesn't concern—" "I said get out of this house." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You're on Pete Dawson's property without an invitation, and you're going to leave right now, or the United States Deputy Marshal, who's riding toward this property at this moment, is going to have some very specific questions about what you're doing here." The thin smile stayed, but his eyes moved to the 2 riders back to Martha, calculating. "Pete," Martha said without looking away from the man, "did you invite these men onto your property?" Pete Dawson's voice was rough when it came out. "No," he said. "I did not." "Clara," Martha said. "Did you?" "No," Clara said. Martha looked at the man with the thin smile. "You have about 30 seconds before this becomes something you don't want it to be." The calculation finished. He put his hat on his head with the deliberate care of a man who wanted it to look like his own decision. "Mr. Dawson," he said as though Martha hadn't spoken, "Mr. Holloway's offer expires today. I'd encourage you to think carefully." "Time's up," Martha said. The man walked out. The two riders followed. The hoofbeats faded down the county road. Martha let out a slow breath through her nose. She turned to Pete and Clara. Clara crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put both arms around Martha and held on. It lasted only a moment. Clara was not a woman given to displays, but it was real, and it said everything that words would have taken too long to reach. Pete set his hat on the table. His hands were shaking slightly. "They told me if I helped you, if I so much as talked to anyone about what I knew Holloway would call in the note on my north pasture." He looked at Martha. "I've got a note with the same bank. I didn't know if he could do it." "He can try," Martha said. "And we'll fight it the same way we're fighting mine." "But Pete, what note? You never told me you had a note with that bank." Pete's jaw worked. "Took it out 2 years ago. Bad season. I was ashamed to say." He looked at the table. "I've been scared since the day I heard he bought yours. I kept thinking if I stay quiet, if I don't make trouble, he won't come for me." "He was always going to come for you," Martha said, not unkindly. "That's how he works. He just hasn't gotten to you yet." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Pete looked up. "What do I do?" "Come to the hearing," Martha said. "This afternoon. Bring Clara. You don't have to testify today, just be there. Let the judge see that this isn't one woman with a complaint. Let him see the county." Pete looked at Clara. Clara looked at Pete with the expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time for her husband to find his footing. "We'll be there," Clara said. Cross appeared in the doorway he'd held back outside, which Martha noted and appreciated. "Marshal Briggs is a 1/4 mile out," he said. Martha nodded. She looked at Pete one more time. "Lock your doors tonight after the hearing. Don't talk to anyone you don't know until this is settled." She picked up her hat. "And Pete, you should have told me about the note. We don't get to help each other if we don't know what the other one is carrying." Pete nodded. He looked smaller than usual, and also somehow more solid, like a man who had just put down a weight and discovered he could stand straighter. She rode back to town with Cross and Briggs, and the hearing was 2 hours away, and Holloway was somewhere in Dry Creek with 3 lawyers and 30 families worth of stolen land, and the absolute certainty, probably, that he was still going to win. Martha was going to enjoy proving him wrong. The Dry Creek courthouse was not large. It was a single main room with benches on both sides and a raised platform at the front for the judge's table and a smaller table for each side's counsel. By the time Martha arrived with Hartwell and Briggs, the benches were already filling. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't put out word, hadn't asked anyone to come. But Dora Finch was there in her good dress, sitting straight-backed in the second row. The Greers were there. Ruth Greer, and a man who must have been her husband, thinner than Martha expected, with the careful stillness of someone who'd been broken and was holding himself together by force of habit. Jim Henderson was there. Tom Mabry was there. Sadie Oakes sat in the back corner with her hands folded and her chin up. Pete and Clara Dawson came in behind Martha and took seats without looking at anyone. Walter came in last. He sat in the back separate from the legal table, and when Martha glanced at him, he gave her one small, deliberate nod. Holloway was at the opposing table. He had 3 lawyers, 1 she recognized from the county, 2 she didn't, who had the look of men brought in from somewhere larger. Holloway himself sat with his hands folded on the table, and his expression arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who had been in courtrooms before and knew how to perform confidence. He didn't look at Martha when she sat down. That was deliberate, too. Judge Emmett Rourke was a lean man in his 60s who wore his authority the way comfortable men wore old boots without thinking about it, because it had been there long enough that it just fit. He came in, looked at the room with the brief, comprehensive assessment of a man who'd seen a lot of courtrooms fill up for reasons that didn't justify the filling, and said, "We'll begin." Holloway's lead lawyer went first. His name was Caldwell, smooth, articulate, with the ease of a man who had won a great many arguments by being better prepared than the person across from him. He argued that the debt transfer was entirely legal. He argued that the acceleration clause was standard in refinancing agreements, and that Mrs. Calloway's father had signed documents he was fully capable of understanding. He argued that Walter Whitmore's involvement represented a conflict of interest, a wealthy outside party attempting to interfere with legitimate local business for his own commercial gain. He used the phrase emotional manipulation once delicately, which was clearly aimed at Martha without being aimed at anyone. How was good. Martha watched the judge while Caldwell talked and worked on reading the man's face and could not read it. Then Hartwell stood. He didn't match Caldwell's smoothness. He was more precise, a man who trusted facts over performance. He laid the documentation on the table. The original loan papers, the appraisal by the late George Aldous, the bank's own 14-year correspondence, confirming the account's good standing, the evidence of procedural irregularities in the debt transfer. He placed each document with the methodical care of someone building something that was going to stand. Then he called Jim Henderson. Henderson walked to the front of the room. He was wearing his best coat. She could tell it was his best because it didn't fit quite right, the shoulders slightly too wide for a man who'd lost weight since the last time he'd worn it. He sat in the witness chair and he folded his hands and he told his story. He told it plainly. No performance, no embellishment. Just the facts of what had happened to him in the order they had happened, with the particular gravity of a man who had been carrying the story for 2 years and was finally setting it down somewhere it would be heard. When Caldwell cross-examined him, he was precise and patient. When Caldwell suggested that Henderson had failed to read the documents he signed, Henderson looked at him and said, "The man who brought them told me they were a payment schedule. A man who can't read isn't the same as a man who was lied to." The room was very quiet after that. Ruth Greer testified next. Then Tom Mabry. Each one precise, each one specific, each one a separate nail in a specific pattern. Caldwell challenged each of them, suggesting misunderstanding, suggesting bad faith, suggesting that personal financial failure was being dressed up as conspiracy, and each of them held. Then Briggs stood and identified himself and stated the federal investigation's findings. Caldwell's smoothness developed its first crack. He objected to the introduction of cross-county evidence as outside the scope of the hearing. Rourke overruled him briefly and without explanation, which was the judicial equivalent of being swatted. Holloway's hands, Martha noticed, had stopped being folded. Then Hartwell said, "Your Honor, we have one additional piece of testimony we'd like to introduce." Caldwell was on his feet. The witness list submitted to this court included no additional names. "This witness came forward this morning," Hartwell said. "Given the federal nature of the expanded investigation, I believe the court will want to hear this testimony." Rourke looked at Caldwell, then at Hartwell. "I'll hear it," he said. "Who is the witness?" The door at the back of the courtroom opened. Harold Fitch walked in. The room shifted in the way rooms shift when something nobody expected walks through the door. Holloway's head moved the first time he'd moved quickly since the hearing began, and he looked at Fitch, and Martha watched something happen in Holloway's face that she had never seen there before. Not anger, not calculation, fear. Fitch was pale. He was sweating in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. He walked to the front of the room without looking at Holloway, and he sat in the witness chair, and he looked at Judge Rourke, and in a voice that shook slightly, but held, he said, "I want to amend my earlier statements to this court. I have information about the Calloway note transfer and 3 other transactions that I believe the court needs to hear." Caldwell erupted. 3 objections in rapid succession procedure, standing admissibility. Rourke shut them down one by one without raising his voice. In the gallery, somebody made a sound that was half breath and half something else. Martha looked at Walter. Walter was watching Fitch with an expression she'd come to recognize, that careful, assessing look of a man who had known things were going to move in a certain direction and was watching them move. He'd known Fitch was going to do this. She'd deal with that later. Fitch testified for 40 minutes. He described the mechanism in specific terms, how Holloway had come to him with the first transfer 3 years ago, how the money had changed hands, how Fitch had been told that cooperation was the safest path, how the cooperation had become, over time, a chain he couldn't break. He described 4 specific transactions he had personally facilitated. He named amounts. He named dates. He named Holloway by name clearly every time in a way that made it impossible to attribute any of it to misunderstanding or coincidence. When Caldwell finally got to cross-examine him, the smoothness was entirely gone. Caldwell was working from the position of a man trying to limit damage to a structure that was already cracking at its foundations. "Mr. Fitch," Caldwell said, "isn't it true that you are testifying today under pressure from federal investigators who have threatened you with prosecution?" "I am testifying today," Fitch said, "because I am 61 years old, and I want to be able to sleep before I die." The courtroom made that sound again. Rourke called a recess. Martha stepped out into the corridor and found Walter there. She looked at him without speaking for a moment. He looked back at her with the steady patience of a man who knew an accounting was coming and was prepared to meet it. "You knew Fitch was going to testify," she said. "Briggs approached him 2 days ago," Walter said. "He wasn't certain until this morning." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because if you knew," Walter said, "you would have tried to prepare for it, and preparing for something that might not happen would have taken your focus away from what you were certain of. You needed to walk into that courtroom today, concentrated entirely on what you knew was real." Martha considered this. It was, she acknowledged internally, a reasonable rationale. It was also the second time he'd made a decision about what she needed to know without asking her. She filed it alongside the first. "We're going to establish some rules," she said. "Yes," Walter said. "We are. Starting after this is finished." "Agreed," he said. She went back inside. Rourke took another 30 minutes after the recess. He reviewed documents. He made notes. He asked Hartwell 2 precise questions, and Briggs 1, and he asked Caldwell nothing further, which told Martha something about where his thinking had landed. Then he set down his pen and looked at the room. "The injunction against foreclosure on the Calloway property is affirmed," he said, "pending the outcome of the federal investigation into the debt transfer methodology identified in today's testimony. All actions against properties subject to the transfer scheme described by Marshal Briggs are stayed. I am referring this matter to the Federal Circuit Court in its entirety." He looked at Holloway directly. "Mr. Holloway, you will surrender your travel documents to Marshal Briggs before leaving this building." Holloway's face was a study in a man discovering that the architecture of something he'd built for 6 years had just developed a crack that ran all the way to the ground. He said nothing. His lawyers said a great deal quickly and quietly directly into his ear. He listened to them with the expression of a man who had stopped hearing words and was hearing only the sound of things ending. Caldwell requested a conference with the judge in chambers. Rourke permitted it. The room shifted and murmured. Martha sat still. Walter came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, which was, she thought, exactly right. After a moment she said quietly, 30 families. "Yes," he said. "That's what he built. 30 families gone from their land." "Yes, we can't give them their land back," she said. "Even if every legal remedy goes perfectly, the ones who sold, who signed things away, who are scattered, some of that can't be undone." "No," Walter said. "It can't." She sat with that for a moment. The weight of it was real, and she didn't try to make it smaller than it was. "But it stops here," she said. "It stops with this hearing." "Yes," Walter said. "It does." The doors to the judge's chambers opened. Rourke came back. He sat. He looked at both tables. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "does your client have anything he wishes to say to this court?" Caldwell stood. He was a professional, and his professionalism held. Even now his voice was even, his posture controlled. "Your Honor, my client maintains that—" "I'm asking your client," Rourke said. Everyone looked at Holloway. Garrett Holloway sat in his chair at the plaintiff's table and looked at his own folded hands for a moment that stretched long enough that the entire room held its breath. Then he looked up. He looked at Judge Rourke, not at Martha. I was not a man who would give her that. No, he said flatly. Nothing to say. Very well, Rourke said. We're adjourned. Marshal Briggs, you know your business. Briggs crossed the room with the unhurried efficiency of a man doing something he'd been building toward for 14 months, and he stopped at Holloway's table, and the room watched Garrett Holloway, who had taken 30 families' land, who had destroyed Jim Henderson's marriage, and Ruth Greer's husband's health, and Sadie Oakes's livelihood, and 11 others in this county alone, stand up from his chair and go with the marshal without visible drama, because men like Holloway always understood when the game was finally over. He passed Martha's table on the way out. He didn't look at her. She looked at him. She didn't say anything because everything that needed to be said was being said by the marshal's hand at his elbow and the courtroom full of people who had come to watch justice finally move. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. Jim Henderson made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a sob, something in between. Ruth Greer pressed both hands over her mouth. Tom Mabry sat with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. Sadie Oakes in the back corner straightened her spine and closed her eyes for one long moment, like a woman saying something privately to someone no longer present. Pete Dawson looked at Martha across the room. His eyes were wet. He pressed his lips together and nodded once the way men in this country nodded when words weren't adequate. Clara took his hand. Martha turned to Hartwell, who was already organizing his papers with the methodical calm of a man who had won a great many cases and had learned not to celebrate until he was certain the building was stable. What happens next? She said. The federal court takes over the main case, Hartwell said. Your property is secure. The other state properties will be reviewed case by case. Some may be recoverable, some may be beyond remedy, but the legal cloud over all of them lifts today. He looked at her over his spectacles. You're free, Martha. Callaway Quarter is yours. She sat with those words. She had been so focused on the fight, on the mechanics of getting to this moment, on the documents, and the witnesses, and the hearings, and the 3 days, and then the 4 days, and all the urgent minutes that had led here, that she had not let herself imagine what it would feel like when the fight was over. It felt quieter than she expected. It felt like standing in a room after a storm, listening to the silence that comes when something that has been roaring for a long time finally stops. Her father's land, her father's name, both of them still standing. She stood up. She straightened her coat. She picked up her hat. The room was still full of people, people talking, people holding each other, people with tears on their faces and relief shaking through them in visible waves. And Martha Callaway walked through all of it toward the door. And people stepped aside for her, not because she was asking them to, but because something in the way she moved through the room said clearly, without a word, that she had done what she came here to do, and she was ready for whatever came next. Walter fell into step beside her at the door. Well, he said. Well, she said. They walked out into the full heat of the Arizona afternoon, and the door of the courthouse closed behind them, and the street of Dry Creek lay ahead. The same street where Holloway had smiled at her 3 days ago, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never lost, and told her that business was business, and waited for her to accept it. Martha looked at that street and felt the sun on her face, and thought about her father digging 40 acres out of the raw desert, with nothing but his hands, and his refusal to quit. She thought she understood him better now than she ever had when he was alive. Martha, Walter said quietly beside her. She turned. His expression was for the first time since she'd pulled him from the desert. Something she couldn't immediately name open in a way that the careful assessing face she'd come to know usually wasn't. Older somehow, and more honest. I owe you more than I can properly account for, he said. You don't owe me anything, she said. I told you that the night I brought you in. You told me that, he said. I didn't believe you then, and I don't believe you now. He paused. There's something I want to discuss with you. About the railroad. About the water rights. About what I think Callaway Quarter could be if you're willing to hear it. Martha looked at him. The sun was high, and the street was alive with the sound of people beginning to understand that something had shifted in Redemption County, that the man who had controlled so much for so long was gone, and the space he'd left behind was open ground waiting. I'm willing to hear it, she said. They didn't have the conversation on the street. Martha looked at Walter, and read the weight of what he was carrying. Not just the railroad proposition, not just the water rights, but something larger and more personal underneath all of it. And she said, "Not here." And he nodded, like he'd expected that. And they walked back to Callaway Quarter in the long afternoon light, with Cross riding behind them at a distance that gave them the privacy of almost being alone. The kitchen table had become over. The past 4 days, something close to a war room. Papers, maps, Hartwell's notes stacked in careful order, coffee cups at various stages of abandonment. Martha cleared it with both arms, in one sweep, stacked everything against the wall, and put the coffee on. And when she turned around, Walter was sitting in the same chair he'd occupied his first night here. Looking at the table with an expression she was beginning to understand, was his thinking face still inward assembling something. "Talk," she said. He looked up. "The railroad line we've been surveying runs 22 miles southeast of here. The original route we planned goes around your eastern pasture by about 3 miles. Because 3 years ago, when we first surveyed, we didn't have reliable water access data for this section of the county." He paused. "What we know now, what your property documents confirm, is that Copper Creek's eastern branch runs directly through your land for nearly a mile before it goes underground. That's the only reliable surface water within 8 miles of our planned route. And railroads need water," Martha said. "Locomotives need water every 40 to 60 miles, Walter said. "We've been planning around a water deficit that doesn't actually exist because the access was here the whole time." Holloway knew that. It's the main reason he wanted this specific property so badly, not just for his cattle operation, but because he understood before we did that whoever controlled this water controlled whether a railroad came through this county at all. Martha sat down slowly. "He was going to sell access to you, or withhold it and force us to the longer route through Maricopa County, which benefits his business partners there." Walter's voice was level, but there was something underneath it, a controlled anger, the kind that had been sitting for a while. "He's been playing multiple sides of this for years. Acquire the water rights. Control the railroad access. Own the county's future before anyone else understood what the county's future was going to be. And you walked into the middle of it by accident," Martha said. "My horse had better instincts than I did," Walter said, which was as close to self-deprecating as she'd heard him get. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "What are you proposing?" "A water rights agreement," he said. "Formal legal fare. The railroad pays Callaway Quarter an annual access fee for the right to draw from the creek during operations. It's not a sale. You keep the land, you keep the rights, you retain full control. We pay for what we use." He met her eyes. "The fee based on the access value and our projected water needs would be enough to retire whatever debt remains on this property fund, proper repairs and restocking, and leave you with operating capital for 3 to 5 years. Martha was quiet. She heard the numbers. She understood what they meant in practical terms, not just survival, but stability. The first real stability Callaway Quarter had seen in 5 years. She also heard something underneath the proposal that needed to be named. "You could have offered me this the first night," she said, "when you found out about the water access." Walter didn't flinch from that. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" "Because the first night you were a woman I owed my life to, and I didn't want you to accept something because you were desperate," he said. "I wanted you to accept it or reject it from a position of strength, from a position where you had options." He paused. "Today, you have options. The property is secure. The legal threat is gone. You don't need this agreement. Which means if you say yes, it's because it's genuinely good for you, not because I'm the only door that's open." Martha looked at him across the table. She thought about the first night, the dying man in her bed, the note on the pillow, the $1,200 in her coat pocket. She thought about every decision that had been made in this kitchen, and in Dry Creek, and in that courtroom, the chain of them, each one leading to the next. And she thought about what kind of man constructed an offer this way, with this kind of care about what the other person's yes actually meant. "The terms," she said. "I want Hartwell to review them independently, not as your lawyer. I'll pay for his time separately." "Of course," Walter said. "And I want a 10-year term with renewal options at my discretion, not yours." Walter nodded. "And I want a clause that says if the railroad route changes and the water access is no longer needed, The agreement terminates without penalty to either party, and all rights revert fully to me. That's standard, Walter said. I'd have included it regardless. I know, Martha said. I'm saying it out loud anyway. Good, he said. You should. She stood up and went to the window, not to look at anything specific, just to move, because sitting still with this much happening in her chest was difficult. Outside, the mare was in the paddock. The barn leaned slightly to the left, the way it always had. The fence line ran straight to the eastern property boundary, where somewhere under the cracked Arizona soil, Copper Creek moved quietly through her land. Her land. There's something else, Walter said behind her. She turned. I was still at the table, but he'd shifted, sitting differently, more carefully, the way people sit when they're about to say something that matters more than the thing they just said. The families, he said. The ones Holloway took land from. Some of those properties are going to come onto the market through the federal proceedings. Distressed sales court, administered disposals. Some of them with legal clouds that will take time to clear. They'll sell cheap. He paused. I want to buy them. Martha waited. Not to hold, he said. Not to develop or control. I want to buy them and sell them back to the original families where that's possible at the price I paid with reasonable terms. He looked at her steadily. I have the money. I have the lawyers who can navigate the court proceedings. And I have, frankly, the motivation, partly because it's the right thing to do, and partly because I want a county full of stable, independent landowners who control their own water rights. Not a county full of distressed properties owned by whoever Holloway's successor turns out to be. The room was very quiet. That's going to be complicated, Martha said. Some of those families are scattered. Some of them have moved on, built other lives. Some of them are going to be suspicious of anyone offering to hand them something they've learned the hard way that offers come with strings. I know, Walter said. That's why I need someone who knows these people. Someone they trust. Someone who isn't coming at them from the outside. He looked at her. I need you to be the one who makes the offer, not me. Me they'll be cautious of. I'm wealthy. I'm from outside the county. I have my own interest here. You're Thomas Calloway's daughter. You fought the same fight they fought. You lost the same things they lost, or nearly. Martha looked at him. You want me to be the face of this. I want you to be the truth of it, Walter said. There's a difference. She sat back down, not because she needed to think she already knew what she was going to say, but because some things deserved the weight of sitting down with them before you said yes. Jim Henderson first, she said. His land is still in Dry Creek County. The court proceedings will be cleaner, and his wife needs to see something turn around before it's too late for what's left of that marriage. Walter nodded. He'd taken out a small notebook and was writing. She noticed his handwriting was the same on the notebook as it had been on the note he'd left on her pillow. Precise, clean, a man who meant what he put on paper. Ruth Greer's husband, she continued. He's not well, but if there's any chance of getting their land back, it might be the thing that brings him back. Some people hold on because they're waiting for a reason. Noted. The Maybry brothers are going to need some convincing. Tom's proud. Prouder than Jim Henderson anyway. He's going to feel like charity even when it isn't. How do we handle that? Martha thought. Give them first right of refusal on a cattle supply contract with the railroad construction operation. Feeding a work crew supplying beef to the camp. Make it a business arrangement. They're entering as equals, not recipients. Then the land purchase is just another business transaction, not a handout. Walter stopped writing and looked at her. What, she said. Nothing, he said. Keep going. The Pierce family from North County. I don't know them as well. I'll need Clara Dawson to make that introduction. Clara has reach I don't. And the widow Oakes? Martha paused. Sadie Oakes is a different situation. She's been managing alone for 3 years. She's built something out of what's left, not much, but something. She might not want the old land back. She might want something else entirely. She looked at Walter. We ask her what she needs. We don't assume. Walter wrote that down too. Then he set the pen down and looked at her with that open expression she'd first seen on the courthouse steps. The one that didn't have the careful assessment in it. The one that was just him. You've been thinking about this, he said. Since the hearing, Martha said. I knew what you were going to propose. Did you? You're not a man who does things halfway, she said. You didn't come back from that desert with lawyers and documentation just to save one ranch. That's not the size of how you think. Walter was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It's not. So. Martha folded her hands on the table. The water rights agreement, yes. The family resettlement plan, yes. Both need independent legal review, proper documentation, fair terms for everyone involved. She paused. And I want it on record formally in the agreement documents that the families are buying their land back, not receiving it as charity. Fair price, fair terms, structured as a sale. Their dignity matters more than the paperwork convenience. Agreed, Walter said immediately and without qualification. She looked at him for a moment. Why does it matter to you, the dignity part? Most men in your position would just handle it. Make it efficient. Walter picked up his coffee cup, found it cold, set it back down. My father was a homesteader, he said. Kansas before the war. He built a farm out of nothing the same way your father did. Lost it when I was 12, drought debt, a bank that moved faster than he could. He looked at the table. He never recovered from it. Not the financial part. Eventually he rebuilt, worked himself back to something stable. But something in him was broken by losing what he'd built with his own hands. By having to accept help from people who looked at him differently after. He paused. I built a railroad company in part because I wanted enough power that no one could ever do to me what that bank did to my father. And I have spent the last 30 years watching men use that same power to do to other people exactly what was done to him. He looked up. I'm tired of it. And I have the means to do something about it, so I will. The kitchen held that for a moment. Martha thought about her father. About the grave she'd dug alone, and the promise she'd made into the empty desert air, and the 14 months of fighting that had led to this table, and this conversation, and this man who had fallen out of the sky into her desert, and turned out to be against all reasonable probability exactly what she needed. All right, she said. We do this together. Walter looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not surprise, not relief exactly, but something that had been held carefully in place for a long time, finding that it didn't need to be held quite so tightly anymore. Together, he said. The next morning, Hartwell arrived at Callaway Quarter at 8 with a draft water rights agreement, which Martha read 3 times before she handed it to him to review independently as she'd requested. He spent 2 hours going through it, asked 4 questions, suggested 2 minor amendments, both of which Walter accepted without argument, and confirmed that the terms were fair and the structure sound. Martha signed. Walter signed. Hartwell witnessed. It took less time than she'd expected for something that changed everything. By midday, she was on the road to Jim Henderson's rooming house in Dry Creek. She'd told Walter she wanted to do this first visit alone, and he'd agreed without pressing. He was learning, she thought, which boundaries to hold and which to let her hold herself. Henderson opened the door in his work clothes midday, which meant he'd come home for something lunch maybe, or to change. He looked at Martha on his step with the expression of a man who'd been through enough in the last week that he was past being surprised by anything. Martha, he said. Jim. She held his gaze. Can we talk? She told him plainly. His land had come into the federal proceedings as an encumbered asset. There was a legal path, not simple, not fast, but real, through which he could reacquire it at the distressed sale price, which was significantly below market, with a structured payment plan that Whitmore Pacific would finance at no interest. She laid out the numbers on his kitchen table the same way Hartwell had laid documents on hers. She didn't dress it up. She didn't soften the parts that were complicated. When she finished, Henderson sat very still. Why? He said. Why would Whitmore do this? Because he has the means and it's the right thing, Martha said. And because I asked him to. Henderson looked at his hands. His wife, Martha noticed, had come into the kitchen doorway somewhere during the conversation and was standing there with her arms crossed, listening, her face doing something careful and private. Alice, Henderson said without looking up. I heard, his wife said quietly. He looked up at her. And Martha, watching, saw the thing that passed between them, the particular look of 2 people who had been through something so hard that it had either broken them entirely or left a seam that was still somehow holding. "I want to go home," Alice Henderson said. Her voice was even. Her eyes were not. Henderson looked back at Martha. "When can it start?" he said. "Hartwell will contact you this week," Martha said. "It won't be fast. Federal proceedings move at their own pace. But it will happen." She shook his hand at the door. He held it a moment longer than a handshake strictly required. "Your father would be proud," he said. "Just so you know." Martha nodded. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. "Take care of Alice," she said when she had it back. "Intend to," he said. She rode from Henderson's to the Greer place, and from the Greer place she sent word through Clara to the Pierce family, and by the time she got back to Calloway Quarter that evening, she was tired in the deep whole way that came not from hardship, but from doing something that mattered until it was done. Walter was on the porch. He'd found a chair somewhere, one of the old ones from the barn she kept meaning to repair, and was sitting in it with his hat off and his face turned toward the last of the day's light. "How'd it go?" he said. "Henderson's in," she said. "Greer will talk to her husband tonight. Pierce family needs another week." She tied off the mare. "Tom Mabry threw me out." Walter looked up sharply. "I'm joking," Martha said. "Mostly. He was difficult. But he'll come around once Clara talks to Ruth and Ruth talks to him." She came up the porch steps. "He's proud. Proudest man in the county. But he's not stupid. He knows a fair deal when he hears one. It just takes him longer to admit it." Walter almost smiled. "And Sadie Oakes." Martha sat down on the porch step. She was quiet for a moment. "I went to see her this afternoon, before I came back. And she doesn't want the land," Martha said. "She wants a job." She looked up at Walter. She was a bookkeeper. Before her husband died, before all of it, she managed the accounts for their operation, and she's good at it. She said, and I'm quoting here, "I don't need 40 acres, Martha. I need someone to treat me like I have a brain in my head and pay me accordingly." Walter was looking at her with that fully attentive expression. "I told her to come and talk to you," Martha said, "about the railroad's regional accounting operation." She held his gaze. "I hope that's all right." "That's more than all right," Walter said. "That's exactly right." She nodded. She looked out at the land, her land clean of debt, now the creek still moving somewhere below the surface of the eastern pasture, the cattle small shapes in the distance doing what cattle did. "There's going to be a lot of work," she said. "Getting the families settled, managing the water agreement, building whatever this thing turns out to be." "Yes," Walter said. "I've been alone with this land for 14 months, she said. "I'm not sure I know how to do something with other people in it." "You knew how today," Walter said. "Henderson, Greer, Oakes. You walked into their situations and said exactly what needed to be said, and you did it without making them feel small." He paused. "That's not a skill most people have. It's not something you learn from a book." Martha looked at him. "Where'd you learn it?" "I didn't," he said simply. "I'm still learning it. From watching people who have it." She let that sit. The desert was cooling now, the way it did in the evenings, fast and thorough, as though it was making up for the day's excess. Somewhere south of the property line, a coyote started and stopped. "Walter," she said. "Martha. When the railroad is built, when all of this is settled, and the legal work is done, and the families are back on their land, what happens to you?" He was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean?" "I mean you'll go back to wherever you came from. Tucson, San Francisco, wherever railroad men go when they're not falling off horses in the Arizona desert." "That's likely," he said. "And this?" She gestured not quite specifically enough to name anything. "Whatever this is, it goes back to being a water rights agreement and a business arrangement and a story you tell people." Walter turned to look at her directly. In the fading light, his face was very clear, all the careful assessment gone, just the man underneath. "Is that what you want it to be?" he said. Martha held his gaze. She was not a woman who looked away from things, and she didn't look away from this. "No," she said. "But I don't know what else it is." "Neither do I," Walter said. "Not entirely. But I know that in 30 years of building things I have never once felt as certain about the foundation of something as I feel about being in this county with you." He paused. "I know that that's not a complete answer." "It's an honest one," Martha said. "I tend to find that honest is more useful than complete," he said. She looked at her land again. She thought about foundations, the way her father had talked about them, the way the ranch had been built board by board and fence post by fence post out of nothing and intention, and the refusal to stop. "Stay a while longer," she said. "After the legal work is settled. There's no rush to get the railroad through, is there?" "There's always a schedule," Walter said. "I've never once kept to one." "Then stay," Martha said. "Help me figure out what this is." The coyote started again, further away now. The last of the light was going west, the way light always went. In this country fast complete, leaving behind a sky that was more stars than dark. Walter reached over and picked up his hat from where it was resting on the porch rail, and turned it once in his hands, the gesture she was beginning to recognize as his version of thinking out loud. "All right," he said. "I'll stay." Martha nodded. She stood up, brushed the dust from her coat, and went to the door. "Coffee's on in the morning before 6, she said. "If you're going to be here, you keep ranch hours." "I was up before you this morning," Walter said. "Beginner's luck," Martha said. She went inside. She heard him laugh quiet, real the laugh of a man who had not laughed easily in a long time, and was finding that it came back faster than he'd expected. She put the kettle on for tomorrow, and stood in her kitchen, her land, her life. If that was beginning now to look like something more than survival, and for the first time since she'd stood at her father's grave and made a promise to the empty desert air, she felt the weight of what she was carrying shift, not disappear. She was not a woman who expected things to disappear. But shift, redistribute, settle differently, the way a load shifts when a second person reaches out and takes part of it without being asked, and you realize only when it's lighter how heavy it has been. She blew out the lamp. She slept without dreaming. 3 days later, Tom Mabry rode into the yard at Callaway Quarter at 7 in the morning, tied his horse at the fence, came to the door and knocked. Martha answered it. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and his chin set, and his eyes doing the thing proud men's eyes did when they were about to say something that cost them. "Clara Dawson told me something," he said. "About the terms. About the way you set it up so it was a sale and not a so it wasn't charity." "That's right," Martha said. "That was you," he said. "That was your idea." "That was the only right way to do it," Martha said. Tom Mabry looked at her. He was in his 50s, weathered in the particular way of men who had worked outside their whole lives and then spent a year indoors trying to forget what outside felt like. "I'd like to talk to the lawyer," he said. "If the offer still stands." "It stands," Martha said. "Come in. Coffee's hot." He came in. He sat at her table. She poured him coffee and went to the door and called across the yard for Walter, who was at the barn with Cross doing something to the fence line that she had told him twice she could handle herself and that he had cheerfully ignored twice. Walter came to the porch. He looked at Martha. She tilted her head toward the kitchen door. He nodded, wiped his hands on his coat, and came in. Tom Mabry looked at Walter Whitmore across Martha Calloway's kitchen table, and Walter Whitmore looked back at him, and Martha stood at the stove with her coffee and watched two men who had both lost things assess whether they were looking at someone who understood what that meant. Something passed between them. She didn't have a name for it. She didn't need one. "Mr. Mabry," Walter said, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down. "Tell me about your land." And Tom Mabry, proud, stubborn, weathered Tom Mabry, who had thrown lawyers out of his rooming house and refused charity from 3 separate sources in the past year, set his hat on his knee and started talking. Martha refilled the coffee and stayed out of it, because some things you built by starting them and then trusting the people in the room to find their own way to solid ground. Her father had taught her that. You laid the foundation. You got out of the way. You let people discover what they were capable of when someone finally gave them the floor. Outside, the sun was fully up, and the land was alive, and the creek was moving quietly through the eastern pasture toward the place where the railroad would eventually cross it, and Callaway Quarter was standing, and the people who had built their lives on this county's soil were beginning slowly and carefully, and with the particular stubborn hope of people who had already survived the worst to find their way back to it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Martha was in the east pasture checking the fence line where the railroad survey crew had been working. 3 men with measuring equipment and notebooks who moved quietly and professionally and always asked before they crossed her land, which she appreciated when Cross rode out to find her with an envelope in his hand and an expression on his face she couldn't immediately read. "Came from Tucson this morning," he said. "Federal court seal." She took it. She didn't open it immediately. She finished what she was doing, checked the last post, confirmed the wire. Tension noted the section that needed attention before winter, and then she sat on the mare and opened the envelope and read it. It took her 3 passes to get through it fully. Legal language moved slowly when it was carrying large things. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and rode back to the house. Walter was at the table with Hartwell and a man from the railroad's engineering office looking at route maps. He looked up when she came in. He read her face the way he'd learned to read it fast, accurately, without asking. "Good or bad," he said. "Garrett Holloway has been indicted by the federal grand jury," Martha said. 31 counts of fraud, coercion, and conspiracy to commit land theft across 3 counties. She set her hat on the table. Fitch has been charged separately. 5 of Holloway's associates are named as co-conspirators. She paused. The court has appointed a federal administrator to oversee the disposition of all properties acquired through the scheme. Hartwell, that means the family resettlement process goes federal. It's going to move faster. Hartwell was already reaching for the letter. He read it, made a sound that was the closest Martha had heard him come to excitement, and said, "The federal administrator process standardizes the terms across all cases. It removes the case-by-case negotiation we've been doing." He looked up. "This is very good, Martha." "I know," she said. Walter was watching her. "You don't look like someone who just won," he said. "I look like someone who's thinking about the families who still haven't heard yet," she said. "Jim Henderson doesn't know. Ruth Greer doesn't know. Tom Mabry doesn't know." She picked up her hat again. "Hartwell, how fast can you get word out?" "Today," Hartwell said. "I'll ride myself if I have to." "You'll ride yourself," Martha said. "Take Cross." She turned to Walter. The engineering man was looking between them with the slightly uncertain expression of someone who had walked into the middle of something that operated by rules he didn't entirely understand. "Give us the room," Walter said to him pleasantly. The man gathered his maps and left without discussion. When the door closed, Walter stood up. He came around the table and stopped a few feet from her and looked at her with that open expression that had stopped surprising her over the past weeks, but had not stopped mattering. 31 counts, he said. 31, she said. It's over, he said. The legal part, she said. The rest of it takes longer. She looked at him. The Henderson place is going to need work before they can move back in. Ruth Greer's husband needs a doctor before he needs land. Sadie Oakes starts with your accounting office next Monday, and she's going to be terrifying at it, which is exactly what you need. She paused. None of that part is over. No, Walter agreed. It isn't. He looked at her steadily. Good thing you have a plan for all of it. Good thing I have help, she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen that had been a war room and a conference table and a place where broken things had been examined and sometimes slowly made less broken. The morning light was coming through the east window. It always came through the east window. First, the side that faced the pasture and the creek and the direction the railroad survey crew worked in careful, measured increments toward something that wasn't built yet, but was becoming real. I need to ride to town, Martha said. I want to tell Jim Henderson myself, in person. I'll come, Walter said. You'll come, she agreed. It wasn't a question anymore. Jim Henderson was at the feed yard when they found him. He was moving sacks, physical labor, the kind of work a man takes when his pride won't let him ask for something easier. And he looked up when Martha rode into the yard, and something in his face shifted the way faces shift when they've been braced for so long against bad news that good news arrives as a kind of shock. She told him standing in the feed yard with his work gloves still on. She told him plainly and completely. And she watched him read the information. The way people read things, they've been hoping for so long, they'd stopped believing it could happen. He took off his gloves. He pressed them against his face with both hands. His shoulders moved once sharply. Then he straightened up and looked at her with eyes that were red at the rims and clear at the center. "Alice," he said. "I need to get to Alice." "Go," Martha said. "Hartwell will come to you tomorrow with the paperwork. Go home to your wife." He went. He didn't even take off his work apron. He just walked to his horse and got on it and rode, and Martha watched him go with something in her chest that was too large and too specific to have a clean name. Walter was beside her. He didn't say anything. He understood she'd come to realize that some moments were complete without commentary. They rode to Ruth Greer next. Ruth was hanging washing when they arrived, the ordinary continuous labor of a woman who kept moving, because moving was how she managed, and she listened to Martha, the same way she'd listened in the hotel back room, with that composed attention that cost her something to maintain. When Martha finished, Ruth set down the shirt she was holding and looked at the ground for a moment. "Daniel," she said, her husband's name. "He needs to hear this from me, not from a lawyer, from me." "Then you go tell him," Martha said. Ruth looked up. "Is it really?" She stopped. "I keep waiting for the part where it doesn't work out." "It worked out," Martha said. "It's real. It's in writing with a federal seal on it." Ruth put her hand over her mouth. Then she lowered it. "Thank you," she said. She looked at Martha, and then at Walter, and then back at Martha. "Both of you. Whatever you did to make this happen." "You made it happen," Martha said. "You walked into that hotel, and you sat across from me, and you told the truth when you had every reason not to. That's what made it happen." Ruth shook her head slightly, but she didn't argue further, and Martha was glad because she believed it, and she needed Ruth to believe it too. The story of what happened in Dry Creek County could not be the story of what Walter Whitmore's money and lawyers had accomplished. It had to be. It was the story of people who had been broken individually and discovered they were unbreakable together. On the ride back, Walter said, "You said the same thing to Henderson, that they made it happen." "Because they did," Martha said. "Hartwell and Briggs and the federal investigation gave us tools," Martha said. "Tools that have existed for years. The difference was the people willing to use them. Jim Henderson walking into that courtroom in a coat that didn't fit him and telling the truth anyway, that's what broke it open. Not the documentation." She looked at Walter. "You understand that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I do." They were halfway back to Callaway Quarter when the rider came toward them on the road, fast pushing the horse harder than the distance warranted. Martha recognized him as one of the young men from the federal administrator's temporary office in Dry Creek. He pulled up. He was breathing hard. "Mrs. Callaway, there's a situation." Martha kept her voice even. "What kind?" "Two of Holloway's men," the rider said. "Not the ones named in the indictment, associates further out. They've been at the Mabry place since this morning. Tom Mabry sent word an hour ago." He looked at her. "They're not threatening exactly, but they're there, and they're not leaving." Martha looked at Walter. Walter looked at her. "Briggs," Walter said. "Get Briggs," Martha said to the rider. "And meet me at the Mabry place." She put the mare into a hard run before the rider had finished turning his horse. She heard Walter behind her keeping pace. Tom Mabry's rooming house was on the south end of Dry Creek. He'd moved in after losing the ranch and hadn't left, partly from inertia, and partly she suspected from the stubborn refusal to get far from land he wasn't ready to stop believing was still his. When she rode into the yard, she could see two men on the porch with the particular posture of men who were not guests and knew it. Tom was at the door. His jaw was set in the way she'd come to recognize the Mabry jaw, which communicated the same thing at all times: "I am still here, and I am not moving." Martha dismounted. She walked to the porch. She stopped in front of the two men, and she looked at them the way she'd looked at Holloway's man in the Dawson kitchen, directly, without performance, without giving them anything they could use. "Holloway is in federal custody," she said. "His assets are under court administration. Whatever he sent you to do here is no longer something you have the authority or the protection to do." She looked from one to the other. "If you're on this property in 20 minutes, you'll be explaining yourselves to a deputy U.S. Marshal. I'd suggest you use the 20 minutes. The two men looked at each other. They looked at Martha. They looked at Walter, who had come up beside her and was standing with his arms at his sides, with the calm of a man who had never once in his adult life been physically intimidated and didn't intend to start. They left. Not quickly, they were too proud for quickly, but they left. Tom Mabry looked at Martha from the doorway. "You didn't even raise your voice," he said. "Didn't need to," Martha said. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, "My brother called this morning, before those two showed up. He's been in New Mexico 2 years working somebody else's cattle." He looked at his hat in his hands. "I told him about the land, about what you and Whitmore are doing." He paused. "He wants to come back." Martha felt something warm move through her chest. "What did you tell him?" "Told him to come on," Tom said gruffly. "Told him there was work to do." She nodded. She looked at him proud. Tom Mabry, who had thrown lawyers out of his rooming house and begrudgingly sat at her kitchen table, and was standing here now with his hat in his hands and his brother coming home from New Mexico, and she thought about what it meant to belong to a place. Not own it. Belong to it. The difference her father had always drawn. "The paperwork will be ready by the end of the week," she said. "Hartwell will come to you." "I'll be here," Tom said. He put his hat on. "Martha." He said her name the way men in this country said names when they meant something more than a name and didn't have other words for it. "Tom," she said the same way. Briggs arrived at this Mabry place 8 minutes later, found nothing requiring his attention, and listened to Martha's account with the expression of a man who was not surprised. He told her that Holloway's two named co-conspirators had turned themselves in to the territorial marshal's office that morning. The indictment had apparently persuaded them that loyalty to Holloway was no longer an asset worth maintaining. "It tends to work that way," Briggs said. "Once the structure comes down, the people who were holding it up realize they were also being held in by it." "What happens to Holloway now?" Martha asked. "Trial," Briggs said. "Federal court. It'll take time, these things always do. But the evidence is substantial, and he knows it." He paused. "His lawyers have already made one contact about a plea arrangement. Will they take it? Depends what he offers, and what the prosecutor decides is worth trading." He looked at her. "My honest assessment. He'll spend time in prison. How much time depends on choices that aren't mine to make." He paused. "I know that's not a clean ending." "Nothing out here has clean endings," Martha said. "Clean enough is what we work with." Briggs nodded. He tipped his hat. He rode back toward town with the efficient purposefulness of a man who had 14 months of work to close out and was already thinking about the next case. Walter came to stand beside Martha. They watched Briggs ride away. "Clean enough," Walter said. "Clean enough," Martha agreed. 3 weeks later, Sadie Oakes walked into the Whitmore Pacific Regional Office in Dry Creek, which had been established in what used to be Fitch's Bank in an arrangement that Martha privately found satisfying, and she sat down behind the accounting desk and opened the ledgers and got to work. By the end of her first week, she had found 3 billing errors in the railroad construction accounts, reorganized the filing system, and sent a carefully worded letter to the supply office in Tucson that resolved a payment dispute that had been pending for 2 months. The office manager sent Walter a telegram that said simply, "Where did you find her?" Walter showed Martha the telegram over breakfast. They had fallen into a habit of breakfast at the Callaway table, just the two of them, before the day's work started, a habit that had begun practically and continued for reasons that had stopped being entirely practical some time ago. "I'll tell Sadie," Martha said. "It'll make her day." "It'll make her insufferable for a week," Walter said, but he was smiling. She looked at him across the table. Outside, she could hear Cross starting the morning feeding. He had stayed nominally as Walter's man, but practically as something closer to a part of the operation that had stopped feeling temporary. The railroad survey crew had finished their work the previous week, and a construction team was due in a month. The county was changing. Everyone could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, something different in the quality of the air. "The Henderson place needs the roof on the east side repaired before they move back in," Martha said. "Jim came by yesterday and we walked it. Another 3 weeks of work, maybe 4. "I'll send 2 of the construction crew over," Walter said. "They're ahead of schedule on the prep work." "They don't need charity," Martha said automatically. "It's not charity," Walter said. "It's labor exchange. Henderson is lending us 2 of his draft horses for the grade work next month. We fix his roof. Nobody's receiving anything for free." Martha looked at him. "You're getting good at this." "I'm learning from a competent teacher," he said. She didn't look away from that. She let it sit between them the way things sat between them now, openly, without either of them pretending not to see it. They'd had the conversation finally on a night 3 weeks after the hearing, sitting on the porch in the dark, with the coyotes in the far distance, and the stars doing what Arizona stars did, filling the sky so thoroughly that the dark between them seemed less like absence and more like depth. Walter had said that he was not a man who did things by half measures, and that he had spent 30 years building things that lasted, and he had no interest at this stage of his life in building something temporary. Martha had said that she was not a woman who made promises she couldn't keep, and she needed to know that what she was promising was real before she promised it. Walter had said that was exactly right. Martha had said that was the right answer. They'd sat on the porch for another half hour in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have said the important things and no longer need to fill the air. It wasn't a conventional courtship. Nothing about any of it had been conventional, but it was theirs, and it was real, and it was built on the same foundation as everything else that had happened in this county over the past months: honesty, necessity, and the stubborn refusal to pretend things were simpler than they were. The Sunday that Jim and Alice Henderson moved back onto their land was a day Martha would carry for the rest of her life. She hadn't planned to be there. She had her own work, always her own work, the endless forward motion of a functioning ranch, and she'd told herself it wasn't her moment to witness that the Hendersons deserved to come home without an audience. But Jim had sent word the day before, "We'd be glad if you came." So she came. The Henderson place was 4 miles north of Callaway Quarter, a spread roughly the same size, the same age, built by the same kind of hands, in the same decade for the same reasons. The roof on the east side was new, clean, pale wood against the weathered rest of it, the mark of recent repair. The fence line had been walked and retensioned. The well had been cleaned out. Jim was standing in the yard when Martha arrived, just standing there looking at it, hat in his hand. Alice was on the porch with both hands on the rail, not moving, just holding it like something that might leave again if she let go. Pete and Clara Dawson were already there. Ruth Greer had come without her husband. He was better, she'd said, but not quite ready for crowds yet, and she stood a little apart with her arms folded and her eyes doing something private. Tom Mabry was there, which surprised Martha slightly. Tom didn't do sentiment, or so she'd understood. He was standing next to his brother, a younger man named Cal, who had the same jaw and the same hat, and had clearly been crying recently and was daring anyone to mention it. Sadie Oakes stood next to Dora Finch, the 2 of them side by side in the way women stand when they've decided to be allies. Walter was at the back of the small gathering. He caught Martha's eye and nodded. Nobody made a speech. That was the thing Martha would remember most clearly. Nobody stood up and said anything formal. Nobody organized it into a ceremony. Jim Henderson just turned to the people gathered in his yard and looked at them all for a moment, and then he said simply and directly, "Thank you for coming home with us." Alice let go of the porch rail. She came down the steps and into the yard, and she put her arm through Jim's, and she looked at the house and the mended roof and the clean fence line, and her face did something that Martha couldn't describe and didn't try to. The gathering moved the way gatherings do, people talking, people finding each other, the low, comfortable sound of a community recognizing itself after a long time apart. Clara had brought food. Dora had brought food. Someone had brought a fiddle, though Martha couldn't see who. She found herself standing next to Walter at the edge of the yard. She was watching Jim and Alice Henderson stand together on their own land, and she was thinking about her father, and she was thinking about the grave she'd dug alone 14 months ago, and the promise she'd made into the empty air, and she was thinking about how the chain of things had led here from a cracked-handle shovel in July heat, to a dying stranger in the desert, to a courtroom full of people who had finally found each other, and how none of it had been inevitable. How all of it had depended on the specific choices of specific people at specific moments, and how the choices that mattered most had not been the large calculated ones, but the small instinctive ones. The decision to stop and check if the shape in the desert was breathing. The decision to tell the truth in a hotel back room. The decision to knock on Tom Mabry's door one more time after he'd already said no. "You're thinking about your father," Walter said. She looked at him. "How did you know?" "You get a particular look," he said. "I've come to recognize it." She considered being annoyed by that and decided she wasn't. "I'm thinking about what he would say if he could see this," she said. "All of it. The ranch, the families, you." She paused. "He would have liked you." "Would he?" Walter said. "I'm a railroad man who fell off his horse." "He would have said a man who falls gets back up," Martha said, "and a man who gets back up is worth knowing." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "What do you say?" Martha looked at him. She looked at the gathering in the Henderson yard, at Pete and Clara, at Tom and Cal, Mabry, at Sadie Oaks, already talking to someone with that new light in her face that had been missing for years at Ruth Greer, standing a little apart with her private feelings at Jim and Alice Henderson, who were home, and she thought about everything this land had cost, and everything it had given, and everything it was still becoming. "I say the same thing," she said. "A man who falls and gets back up is worth knowing." She held his gaze. "You've been worth knowing, Walter Whitmore." He reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not urgently. With the deliberate, quiet certainty of a man who had decided something and was not going to undecide it. She let him. 6 months later, the first train came through Redemption County. Martha stood at the edge of the eastern pasture, exactly where she'd stood 100 times, checking the fence line and checking the cattle and checking the creek level and carrying the whole weight of the property alone on those broad shoulders that the town of Dry Creek had once whispered about and underestimated and pitied. She was not alone now. Walter was beside her. Cross was there. Pete and Clara Dawson had ridden over. Jim Henderson had come with Alice, who was laughing at something Jim said the way she'd apparently laughed once years ago before everything. Tom Mabry and his brother Cal were at the fence, and Tom had his hat off watching the horizon with an expression Martha had never seen on his face before, open, unheld something approaching wonder. The sound reached them before the train did. A low carrying vibration in the air that built gradually into something you felt in your chest before you heard it properly. Then the smoke rising. Then the shape itself coming through the territory at a speed that still made people blink the first time they saw it. This iron thing moving faster than horses, faster than weather, carrying the future through the present in one long, inevitable line. The train crossed the Callaway Water access at full speed. The creek gave it what it needed, as it would give year after year, according to the terms of a contract that was fair and documented and signed by a woman who had known her own worth when almost no one else did. Cal Mabry let out a sound halfway between a shout and a laugh, and his brother Tom turned and looked at him and then unexpectedly put his arm around the younger man's shoulders. Tom Mabry, who didn't do sentiment standing with his arm around his brother, watching the railroad come through the county they'd nearly lost, and his face doing something private and ungovernable that he didn't try to hide. Alice Henderson reached for her husband's hand. He took it. He held it. Clara Dawson pressed her face briefly against Pete's shoulder. Pete put his hand up and held her there gently, the way men hold things they know the value of. Walter turned to Martha. She was still watching the train, feeling the ground carry its vibration up through the soles of her boots, feeling the weight of everything. This moment contained her father's work. 14 months of fighting. 30 families. One dying stranger in the desert. One promise made to empty air. She turned to look at Walter. He was watching her, not the train. He had, she realized, not looked at the train at all. "You're supposed to be watching," she said. "I know what a train looks like," he said. "I've never seen this before." She looked back at the train and then back at him, and something moved through her that was too complete and too specific to survive translation. The particular feeling of a person who has carried something enormous alone for a very long time and has finally fully been met by someone who understands the weight. "Walter," she said. "Martha," he said. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those faded blue eyes that had looked up at her from a desert floor when he was dying and found something real enough to hold on to. Then he asked her. She said yes, the way she'd always said the things that mattered most, directly, completely, without looking away, without softening the edges or leaving any part of it unsaid. One word that meant everything she was and everything she had built and everything she intended to keep building on this land, with this man in this county, that was healing itself. One returned family at a time. The train passed. The sound faded west. The land settled back into its own quiet, and the creek moved through the eastern pasture, and the cattle were strong, and the fences were straight, and the roof of the barn no longer leaned in hard wind, because Walter had fixed it 3 weeks ago without asking, and she had let him. Jim Henderson started talking to Pete Dawson about the spring cattle drive. Alice and Clara fell into conversation about something that made them both laugh. Tom Mabry put his hat back on and turned to his brother and said something that made Cal grin. Sadie Oakes, who had ridden over from town on her own horse in her own time, was already making notes in a small book she carried everywhere. The gathering began to move. The way. Gatherings move when the event is over and the life continues. And Martha stood in the east pasture of her father's ranch and felt the ground under her boots and the sun on her face and the presence of the man beside her, and she knew what she was and where she belonged and what she was worth. Nobody had given her that knowledge. Nobody could take it away. There are women the West forgot to record. Women who dug graves alone and rode boundary lines in killing heat and fought in courtrooms where no one expected them to win, and pulled dying strangers from the desert on days when they had every reason to leave them there. Women who were judged by what they looked like, instead of what they carried, underestimated by men who confused softness with weakness, and size with limitation, and aloneness with defeat. Martha Calloway was one of those women. She had buried her father alone and promised the empty air she would not lose what he built, and she had kept that promise, not by waiting for rescue, but by building the rescue herself out of truth and stubbornness, and the radical frontier-tested belief that a person's worth was not determined by what other people decided to see when they looked at them, but by what that person chose to do when no one was watching and nothing was guaranteed, and the only resource left was the refusal to quit. The ranch her father built became more than a ranch. The water that ran through her eastern pasture fed the railroad that connected the county to the territory and the territory to the world. The families who had been scattered and broken found their way back to their land one by one, because a woman had decided that her victory was not complete until theirs was too. The county Garrett Holloway had built his empire on became instead the county that proved what a community could do when it stopped being afraid of the same man at the same time. And the woman. Everyone underestimated the heavy-set ranch woman who was too soft, too alone, too poor, too stubborn. Too much of the wrong kind of everything turned out to be the exact right kind of person for exactly this moment in exactly this place. Some things once built on the right foundation do not fall. Martha Calloway knew that now in her bones, the way you know the things that have been tested against the hardest ground and held. She was home. She had always been home, and she was never not for one more day of her life going to let anyone make her forget it.